What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. A recently released action-adventure, of course, set in the Indiana Jones franchise that sees us fighting Nazis in 1937. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There is a link below to a video covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. In the case of this game though, while this is going live pretty close to the release date, I did not receive a review copy of this. I did pay for it, and in particular, I bought the premium edition, which came with a few days early access, which is when I jumped into it, which is how I'm bringing you this review so close to its full release day. As after watching several of the previews, I was interested, and generally, as a content creator, I'm going to buy the edition that gives me access to future DLC if I want to cover that too, as it is a tax write-off either way. What's more, before we jump fully into this, initially during the early access period, I was pretty sure one of the achievements was bugged, but it looks like the day one patch pretty well sorted that out and I was able to get it, which comes down to collectibles. This game is a very easy 100%. You can go back and revisit all the areas you've been to even after the story is over and collect everything you may have missed, but in the early access period, some of that stuff looked like it would disappear afterwards, but that day one patch made sure that those remained available and I was able to go back and grab them, so that fixed the problems I had. But what's more, not only can you go back and collect these collectibles, you'll also get access to like little guidebooks that will tell you exactly where they are if you purchase them from vendors, so it's very easy to go grab all this stuff, which put the entire process at right around about 35 hours. But now let's talk about the actual game proper. So this game is, as I mentioned, an action-adventure set primarily in first person, though it does offer a third-person perspective at key moments. And while with its initial marketing and everything, I assumed it would be a fairly linear story, it does have a little bit of that, especially in between the game's three major areas. But most of the game is actually kind of a mix of games like Dishonored and other M-Sims that give you a large explorable area to mess around with and navigate as you see fit. These areas have full-on side quests, collectibles, as I mentioned, things to explore, puzzles to solve, secrets to unveil, the whole 9 yards. And in those areas, while certain quests are pretty, straightforward in how they can be approached, many of them have a fairly, I would say, choose-your-own-adventure style where you can go either stealth or guns blazing or anything in between, really, in order to seek out your objectives. And I really enjoyed that, and I was not expecting that from this title, which really put it over the top for me. But at a $70 base price, a game like this always had a pretty tall mountain to climb, and for the most part, I think they surprisingly managed to do it. But even still, given its availability on Game Pass, I imagine that's where most people will be playing this one. But let's dive into it fully, starting off with the technical state. Now, another reason I think people might be playing this on Game Pass more than anything else is that, while I didn't run into any problems, it's definitely worth a mention that the requirements to run this game are actually pretty steep over on PC. In fact, ray tracing is a mandatory requirement, and while most, I would say, graphics cards these days can in fact do ray tracing, if you're still running something like a 10 series card all these years later, you might have a big problem. So I would pay special attention to that and make sure that if you're buying this on PC especially, that you have a computer capable of actually running it well. Now, I would say much of the reason for those beefier requirements are simply the fact that the game does look fantastic. But all of that to tell you how the game actually seems to be running, and personally, I didn't run into any issues that weren't pretty much entirely cosmetic in nature or specific to my role as a content creator, which I'll touch on. But I will mention that a quick look through Steam forums on how this game is running for people, and the reviews, of course, people have reported problems, especially with like 20 series cards, or only having like 16 gigs of RAM, which does technically meet the game's minimum requirements. So if you're gonna have issues here, I'm pretty sure it's probably gonna be with simply hardware. Now, I mentioned a few problems specific to content creators. Some games just really hate being recorded. This was one of those games I had to record in like short 10-minute bursts because otherwise it would crash the game on me, but otherwise it ran perfectly fine for me at least. And beyond just that, I'd occasionally get like a janky animation with things moving in ways that would definitely be impossible, or like the whip not actually returning to your side, instead it would just kind of keep flailing around. So little things like that. Personally, I didn't run into anything game breaking. Moving on though, let's talk about difficulty. difficulty. Now, generally speaking, as an action-adventure, I would not classify this as a particularly difficult series of games anyway, but we do have a few options for difficulty, and specifically they come down to the puzzle difficulty and then the actual adventure difficulty. This game does feature a lot of different puzzles, and you can choose to play with those on an easier version that will simplify a lot of them, so you can focus more on the other parts of the gameplay. Now, I will say that even with this turned on, that is to say its normal setting, you can actually take pictures of like the big progress-related puzzles that will, tell you essentially what to do via hints the more you take pictures of them. So I didn't notice any puzzles that were like particularly unsolvable or anything like that, and plus, as this has been out a while, there's guides for all of it already anyway. But if you're the kind of person who does not like puzzles, the option does exist to tone it down. And then the adventure difficulty is more about how hard combat is, and naturally the higher it goes, the more deadly enemies are, and the more of the enemies you will face, so they can often swarm you. Now realistically, enemies swarming you is likely the only way you're going to die, because they don't pose much of a threat generally otherwise. Which isn't helped along by, I would say, one of my larger criticisms of the game is simply that the enemy AI could use some work. They're not the brightest bulbs. In fact, oftentimes you can win against overwhelming numbers anyway, just because the enemy doesn't exactly react to you super well. In fact, sometimes they'll basically line up to be killed by you. Though I did notice that they will default to melee if you are using melee for the most part, but the second you pull out a gun, most enemies will also pull out a gun, which is where you're likely to get killed the most if it happens. But I do think they could do some tweaking there to make that feel a little better overall. Now that does bring us to the story setup and my thoughts on it. So Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is naturally about Indiana Jones, but specifically in 1937. This puts it between the events of Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Last Crusade. Following a dream sequence, Indiana wakes up at Marshall College only to find it being burglarized by an incredibly large individual who knocks you out before stealing what it is he came for. When you come to, you find clues that lead you to the Vatican, which is where Indiana manages to figure out that this might just have something to do with the Great Circle, as it's called, which is a series of historical sites that, when lined up on a globe, all form a perfect circle. Now, in the context of real life, just in case you're wondering, this is like from an internet theory way back, but it's the kind of thing that just has like enough veneer of believability to come across as something really fun, and for the most part, I think they played into that really, really well. Now, while we start off at Marshall College and then the Vatican, this does ultimately become a globe-spanning adventure going to several different places like the pyramids at Giza, the Himalayas, and even Shanghai briefly. And that was really cool. I enjoyed going to all these different places in the game and kind of seeing all of those different areas through the lens of course, this video game. But that, alongside the mysteries being drip-fed to you and how they actually relate to the plot, does, I think, culminate in a pretty satisfying end to this game. And while I don't want to spoil it for people, I will say that it kept me guessing basically up until the end. Moving right along though, let's finally talk about progression systems. So, progression in this game is relatively simple. As you explore, find things, collect notes, solve side quests, little mysteries, you'll be rewarded with adventure points. You can spend these adventure points on the various books you find. These books will potentially teach you different abilities, such as the ability to knock out enemies unarmed, or use your abilities against the heavier versions of enemies, like being able to push them or simply knock them out unarmed, things like that. And collecting both those books and then the adventure points to actually buy the abilities with forms the vast bulk of progression. Pretty simple stuff there. Now, there are a couple of other things, namely in the form of items that you'll have to play through the game to get, which give you access to a couple of other things. Like, for instance, you'll get a lighter that can both be used as a torch, essentially, will also enable you the ability to burn down certain things, which can give you access to things you didn't have previously, which is also the case for a breathing device to let you get into some underwater areas later. And then there are things like disguises in each explorable area. You'll need to find those if you plan to make use of them, which is almost certainly going to be a requirement here and there. So progression is honestly very simple, but it is compelling enough for the type of game this is to make it interesting. Which brings us to the gameplay world and a bit of combat at the same time, as combat is fairly simple and mostly it goes into how you approach the world. So we're going to lump it in here. Now, as I mentioned, this game has linear moments. There are sections of the game that are quite small and linear in nature, but these lead into the bigger three explorable areas, the Vatican, Giza, and then later on, Sukhothai. As I mentioned, both the linear areas, or the certain sections of those linear areas, I should say, alongside the big explorable places can be revisited later on, though you do have to work around the game's frustrating save mechanic, in my opinion. So this game uses a checkpoint system, perhaps unsurprisingly given Machine Games' previous work, but it can be a little annoying in this specific instance because if you revisit an area, gather up what you're missing, and then you leave before the game marks a checkpoint, your save won't be registered. So you either have to go back to a specific point that the game will always autosave on, or just wait until it does it somewhere else. So that's kind of annoying. But we're going to be talking about these big explorable areas. So what is there to do in these places? Well, we have fieldwork. Fieldwork are your big proper side quests. These are complete with cinematics and stuff. There's only like 3 or 4 per area, but they are quite large in nature and they go very in-depth on certain things, while of course letting you explore and run around as Indiana at the same time. Now beyond that, we then have discoveries. Discoveries are effectively collectibles, things you can find around the map for adventure points that aid in exploration, I would say, and give you a reason to look in all the nooks and crannies of these individual explorable places. But we also have mysteries. Mysteries are like tiny, small quests. These are pretty quick in nature and usually just involve you either solving a puzzle of some sort or quickly getting to the bottom of something. This can be things like coming upon a locked chest and having to figure out the code for it, or finding your way into a certain little room, things like that. Now, along the way, as I mentioned, disguises can be a pretty big part of this. You have your normal Indiana Jones outfit, but oftentimes you'll get recognized pretty readily in that particular outfit. So this is where the disguises come in. Sometimes you'll be given some of these, sometimes you have to go find them. But disguises, of course, allow you to pass through enemy camps relatively unscathed because captains of each individual area will be able to see through your disguise and, of course, alert everyone around you. So as long as you avoid them, you'll be good. Unless, of course, you want to go full guns blazing, and this is a big part of exploring all these different historical places you're going to be in. And deciding whether or not you want to use those disguises and the stealth system to sneak into a place or run in guns blazing, so to speak, is primarily the main gameplay choices you'll be making. Now, obviously, you can have some combinations of things in between that, so let's talk about some of your options there. Now, a lot of this, of course, will be dictated by your upgrades, but at a base, you have typically a weapon of some sort related to the current disguise you have on. This can be like a revolver or another pistol, or a cane in the case of the clerical outfit, things like that. You also have your fists, of course. There's plenty of fist fighting to be had, and you can pick up one-handed and two-handed melee weapons at the same time. And then last, we of course have our whip. Now, melee is pretty straightforward, not much to say about it outside of you basically punch everything that moves. You can do a charge up to get through a block, but mostly whether or not you are outnumbered here is going to be the key deciding factor, and how good you are at hopefully parrying, so to speak. And it all works basically the same with your melee weapons, though some will do more damage than others. Probably worth a mention that two-handed melee weapons can often be used to traverse the environment by breaking down certain walls and whatnot. And then there's those guns. The main thing you gotta watch out for with guns is that the second you pull out a gun, a lot of enemies will usually also pull out their guns. And if you are vastly outnumbered, that's probably not a fight you're gonna win. Not to mention, they make a lot of noise, so they'll typically alert other enemies in the vicinity, meaning that more often than not, going in guns blazing, or at least specifically using a gun a lot of the time, wasn't always the best solution, but it did have its moments where it was effective, especially once you start being able to pick up some machine guns from enemies later on. Now, you can also use your whip in these interactions as well, both for traversal as well as combat. In combat, you can use it to disarm aware enemies, and then with some upgrades, you can use it to knock out unaware enemies later on as well. In traversal, you'll use it essentially as a rope, either swinging from ledge to ledge or using it to climb up things and stuff like that. So the whip feels like a pretty important part of the overall experience, so try not to forget it. Now, you're going to be doing all of that while exploring these open areas, which consists of, I would say, basically like the ground floor, so to speak, the main area you'll be running around in, but you can also find like several dungeons, which are usually related to things like the field work or even the main story in many cases, where you'll be able to explore a proper little segmented dungeon that has its own secrets and explorable areas as well. And even those tend to come with their occasional surprise, like, say, a bigger boss fight style type of thing. So the life of an archaeologist apparently is quite fraught with danger, it would seem. Now, for the most part, I had a blast with a lot of this. The systems feel great to mess around with. You can often choose how you approach most things. Using all the different modes of combat feels great. I like how they managed to solve the problem of essentially just being a murder hobo by making guns accessible and possible to use, but, not always your best option either. And considering that I went into this basically just expecting a linear action adventure that was probably just going to be okay, this game surprised me a lot with all of its different systems and how fun they would be to actually use, which I would say is probably the most remarkable thing about this specific game. Now, two things, however, get in the way of that experience, for me at least. As I've already mentioned, the AI can be a little, let's say, unintelligent at times. I think they could probably stand to ramp that up and make them a little more reactive. And while it is an action adventure, I'm not exactly looking for like Dark Souls levels of enemies, especially when you're going to get swarmed at some point. But I think making them be a bit more reactive would go a long way. And then the other thing is, I just don't enjoy the save system for this one. Using this checkpoint system that I can't just either force a manual save or an auto save on without running to a specific area or something is a little bit annoying, especially when you're trying to revisit old areas and you have to like force it to trigger one of those saves before you can safely leave again. And while it's not the biggest complaint in the world, it does get annoying after a while. But that brings us to the Steam Deck section. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the game's minimum requirements and the ray tracing and everything, this game plays pretty poorly on the Steam Deck. I would not recommend it because, technically, in the most literal interpretation of it, you can get it running there, but you're going to be dealing with things like assets just missing, terrible frame rate, even at the lowest settings. And given the rest of the information about the requirements for the game, I'm not sure I would ever expect this to run well on that platform or if they have any plans to make it so, as that strikes me as exceedingly unlikely, so I just would not expect to play this game on that platform. Which brings us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, I really enjoyed the veneer of believability alongside the story and how that played into it and all these discoveries you make at historical places like the Vatican and Giza and stuff. It's just the kind of slightly alternative history that can be really compelling, and I enjoyed that pretty much all the way through. And getting to explore those historical sites and stuff was great. And being able to do that while also being able to have a surprising amount of freedom in how you approach any of those things individually was a surprising treat on my end. This game was much more than I expected it to be, which, considering I expected it to be a fairly linear action adventure that was maybe a little run-of-the-mill, was incredibly pleasantly surprising. But nonetheless, a couple of negatives. As I've already mentioned, pretty much just the AI and the save system. I'm not a fan of the save system in particular. I think they could have done something a little more just manual save or allowed you to more readily save on exit as an example, as not being able to do so just feels odd, frankly. But that on top of the AI being probably just a little too dumb are going to be the bulk of the problems I have with the game itself. But putting all of that together for my conclusion here, I will say that this game was surprising in the best way. It was a lot more than I was expecting it to be. It puts all these systems together in a way that just makes a lot of sense. And more than anything, it was just a lot of fun. But that, of course, has to be justified against its price tag. And I did about everything for this in 35 hours. And while I do this for a living, so it's probably going to be a bit faster than most people, they might not be inclined to shell out $70 full for the base game. That said, personally, after having played it, I would happily pay $70 for this. I, in fact, paid more for it, given that I bought the premium edition. But luckily, if that price isn't something you want to deal with, it is available on Game Pass, of course, and in particular, I would say this actually feels like a really great game for Game Pass. So while I'm giving it a buy, if the price is too steep for you, I would just check it out on Game Pass, and hopefully you'll be as pleasantly surprised by it as I was. Which is where we are finally going to wrap up this particular review. So hopefully you enjoyed all of that. If you did, by all means, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know how you feel about it down in the comments section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.